So I'm Leila Ebrahimi. I co-lead the reward practice at PwC. I'm the editor of the non-executive directors report, but obviously being the editor, as you know, doesn't mean that I do the whole thing myself. So there's a fantastic team behind me. Some of them are on the call today and others are not. But as you can imagine, it takes a village to write this report of ours. This is obviously the non-executive director report, which focuses on the fees of non-executive directors and then trends and themes relating to board members. We put a little bit of a REM spin on it, obviously, because we're the reward team, but other issues as well, wider issues that are affecting boardrooms. Today, we're going to try and bring that to relevance for this particular audience. So we'll be talking about some of the aspects of the report which we think you might be dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, that's me, and I'll hand over to Andreas to introduce himself, and then Kosi and Mariangela.
Morning, everyone. Yeah, so I'm the other co-lead of the business. I'm not the editor of the report, but I do look after data and data analysis, specifically within the reward team. I think the report effectively provides a lot of detail regarding principles that we drive, I think, progressive boardroom conversations. The aim is always to see how we can improve the principles of REM for all parties concerned, because it is an emotive topic and we've got some specific challenges from a South African perspective that we need to address. So I'm very excited about the session. I feel that the people in the room that we're talking to today is going to play a fundamental role in how fair pay and ESG and the great resignation is going to be fended off. We need to make sure we secure our skills, not only from an SAN perspective, but also just from a pure enterprise perspective for every single business. So very excited. I'm just going to hand over to Kosi, and then Kosi, maybe you can just hand the mic to Mariangela when you are done. Thanks.
Thanks, Andreas. Morning, everyone. My name is Kosi Mabaso, and I'm an associate director within the rewards team. I've been part of the team that's been working on the report for quite a number of years now, and it's been very exciting working on it over the years. I think this year's report discusses very important topics that will have quite a lot of the users think and how they impact society and how they change things going forward. One of which is the article on the living wage. I think that's it's a very important topic to just discuss and see how we can change people's lives going forward. So I'm looking forward to discussing that with you. And then I was just looking forward to hearing your views on it as well. I'll hand over to Mariangela to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Kosi. So everyone who doesn't know me, my name is Mariangela Venturi, and I'm a senior manager in the PwC reward practice. And like with Kosi, ever since I joined PwC, I've been a part of the ED and NED report. And I think it's usually a very tense but very exciting time for us as we put the themes together and collate all the information. And this year we got a bit of input from the NEDs this time, but I'm very excited to share this report with you. It's been a lot of, I don't know whether Leila mentioned it, but it's been a labor of love. So thank you, everyone.
The term I generally use.
Yeah.
Super, thanks, guys. Okay, so just moving on then to the themes. It's always a big report. We can't focus on everything today, and also just to mention, if you don't have a copy of the report, please pop us a mail so we can get that to you. But also, if you just Google PwC Non-Executive Directors Report 2022, it should be the first thing in your Google, and you can just download it easily off that website, or you can find me on LinkedIn and you can download it there. It should be widely available. We obviously want it to be widely available. Yeah, so as Mariangela mentioned, we did a non-executive director survey this year for the first time. I mean, this is our 15th edition of the report. It's been going for a very, very long time. It started off with analyzing non-executive directors' fees, and basically what do we pay to chairpersons, what do we pay to non-executives, different committees, etc. And it kind of morphed into more of a wider thought leadership piece, as I mentioned earlier. But this is the first year that we've actually gone out and surveyed REMCO members and said, okay, what's top of mind for you? What are the priorities? What are the risks? And we'll go through a little bit of that later this morning. Another thing that came up, obviously top of mind for everyone, is this great resignation. And being in reward, obviously a lot of questions we get from clients such as you is, how do we stop this? What do we do? What do we do about retention payments? What do we do about retention bonuses? And the uptick in sign-on bonuses and retention payments globally has been quite remarkable. As we all know, shareholders pushing back on that, not liking rewards that are not associated with pay for performance, obviously at the executive levels. And we've got questions about what do we do? What is the next thing? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Are your employees among the working poor? Always something that, is a little bit controversial, but shouldn't be. We're basically saying in terms of ESG, which is so top of mind for everyone. It's not just about climate change, climate risk. It's also about the social aspects and paramount within that is the living wage and how are you paying employees. Certainly, all of us on the call today are very close to that, and we're very acutely aware of the whole fair and responsible remuneration. And we've had clients asking us, what does it mean to pay fairly and responsibly? It seems like such a vague concept. What does it actually mean? What is the ethics of pay? So, each year we try to explore that in our reports and just unpack the thinking of that a little bit more, because certainly within our country, it means something different to within other countries. Every country has its own nuances, and we need to define what that means in a South African context. And before doing that, we need to understand what are the facts. So our article this year, are your employees among the working poor, is talking about living wage. We know we don't have an official living wage in South Africa, but what would a living wage look like? What is the data we've got available? What are the numbers we're talking about? And who does that support? Is that a living wage for one person supporting themselves? What about if they have a family? Just so that when you are making these decisions, when you are having these conversations within your organization, you can actually understand the facts and say, okay, well, we know that if we pay this to an individual, they cannot meet their basic needs. And that can be a starting point for discussion, which I think is quite sobering. And then obviously ESG from apathy to action. The theme here being that we know you're all inundated. You cannot log into a News 24 or whatever your preferred reading platform is, or LinkedIn, or even just have a braai these days. Maybe you can have a braai without talking about ESG. And we're saying, hang on a sec, let's just take a step back, assess where you are, let's be honest about it, and let's move forward from there with discussing ESG. And obviously, our spin on this is always, you need to reward what you want to incentivize. So the actions and the behavior that you're looking for, you need to make sure they find their way into your reward structures. And we'll hopefully have time to chat a little bit about that. So overarchingly, it's purpose, retention, risk. Those are the key themes that are coming out. Just to mention on the risk thing as well, and I'm sure it'll come up in conversation, Companies Act always being top of mind with these amendments that they're bringing through, with the mandatory wage gap disclosure, with the binding vote on the policy, with the sanctions for REMCO members should the implementation report not be voted on. And we're thinking, well, what are REM reports going to look like in a few years from now? We had a shift 10 years ago where we moved into this 3-part report. And everyone's kind of there now. Well, what is the next thing? Where are we going to be putting performance targets and performance conditions? How are we going to be disclosing those? And we're already seeing our clients grappling with what their REM reports look like and moving it away from the standard template that they've been using for the last 5, 6, 7 years now, some less. All right, so moving on to our first theme then, fending off the Great Resignation. It's exciting. I think globally, the research, funny enough, we don't necessarily have that much data available in South Africa. And obviously, our unemployment rate is so high, and that's quite unique in the world, not in a good way. Globally, we're seeing that what it really is a reassessment of one's purpose and the alignment of one's purpose with organizational values, and just saying, what do I want out of my life? Am I happy with my life as it is? So it's a pause, and COVID brought about that pause. And I think interestingly, we've been saying for a while, and I know many other players have been saying, this is going to happen. Start thinking about your organizational values and mission and purpose, because at one point, this new generation of employees is going to come and ask you, hey, what are the values of our organization? And they're going to assess whether they align with their own personal values. We didn't expect COVID to be the thing that brought this about. We never anticipated COVID, but certainly it accelerated that trend. And interestingly enough, it isn't just amongst the youth or the new generation. Now everybody is asking these questions. So the return to office, as I call it, the RTO, because we've got WFH, the work from home, and now we've got RTO, return to office. We have generational conflicts in the workplace where the older generations are saying, get back in the office. I've got this dead asset. I mean, I'm calling you from that PwC tower in Midrand. It's sticks out on the horizon, and it's been sitting empty for a couple of years, with not many people coming into it. And we have executives and more senior individuals saying, come on, let's get back to the office now. It's time to get back to normal. And then we have pushback from others saying, you know what? This is not normal for us anymore, and we don't want to come back. And what does that mean? And how do we think about that? And how is that affecting your attrition rates? And I'm sure you're all dealing with this on some level, within your day jobs. And the push always on us as reward professionals is, what can we do to stop the bleeding? How can we stop it? How do we plug this? And to quote, something that I said to our own human capital a few days ago was, maybe we need to stop looking at retention as the problem. Maybe it's just a new normal that people will leave and their attrition rates will be higher than they were before. And maybe we just need to accept that and look at it from a different angle. So that's something left field, and not necessarily where we want to go today. Obviously, there are individuals that you want to retain, and you need to, you need to be able to split out why are people leaving and see who is possible to retain, and then do it in a cost-effective way. And that's where we started exploring with some of our clients, and we've noticed the uptick in what we broadly call co-investment plans. And I think, Andreas, I'll hand over to you to kind of take us through the basic premise, but moving away from this is long-term incentives being a traditional CSP, a conditional share plan, or a forfeitable share plan where you get a share, you have to perform TSR, HEPS, RONA, whatever, ROE, and then you kind of get your award in 3 years. Moving towards, how can we look at this differently, and how can we incentivize people differently? And is there something to the skin in the game that shareholders have been asking for a while now?
Yes, Leila, maybe just to elaborate a bit on that. I think when you have a look at successful business strategies historically, and I think a lot of people would be aware of the statistics backing it up, continuity in your management team is one of the critical components that drives success, specifically if you've got a high-performing team with a good culture and all of those things. You see it quite often in sports teams as well. The longer they can get the unit to stay together, winning becomes a habit, and consequently, you start showing great growth with not only within the individuals, but within the business as a whole, and so forth. So succession planning in the ambit of the Great Resignation is a real headache. Because if you're looking at the higher instances of where it's occurring, the age group of 30 to 45s, that will typically be your succession layer that you're trying to upskill, get great exposure, experience, and then they could be gone. And that's where the question came in regarding the co-investment plan. There's so much noise associated with long-term incentives, and that no one understands them, and they're completely beyond your control, that the co-investment plan is effectively a method of how we're trying to drive long-term commitment by both parties to a joint purpose, a joint value system, something where both parties can flourish from and work together. Okay, and to do that, what's the most simplistic way to do it? And we've asked the question: isn't it someone giving up a component of their bonus, investing it in the business, and then effectively receiving a matching award, with a matching award associated with a commitment being delivered over a period of time? And that's it. And then the question comes in, what form of commitment do you require? Do you require a 5-year commitment rather than a 3-year commitment that you'll typically have on your LTI? Do you require a form that in the event that you resign from the job, that you understand that it will be an ethical issue if you join a competitor in the same industry, and how will that impact your matching incentive, and all of those type of things. And the idea behind it is to keep it as simple as possible, but to get both parties as quickly as possible committed to a common goal. And I think that was maybe one of the things that we felt should be something that is easier understood, and it could bear probably better fruit. But the question is always how shareholders feel about it. Shareholders typically look at a matching incentive as a freebie rather than as a strategic retention mechanism. And that narrative needs to change if businesses believe that a co-investment plan can help them fend off the great resignation and drive their succession planning within their businesses.
I think also many companies are dealing with minimum shareholding requirements that have been, quote unquote, forced upon them by shareholders. And you all know, that executives are not always the biggest fans of these. And we've had, certainly after COVID, excuse me, after COVID and after LTIs and STIs not vesting, we've had more pushback on these because people were just not meeting their targets, and they were cash strapped, and there were needs on the cash, whether those were health needs or whatever the case might be. Things were different, and people were pushing back. So we've had more and more exploratory conversations with clients where they are asking the question, is it okay to just implement a minimum shareholder requirement, or can we get shares, free shares for committing shares? And many of us have had this conversation. It's a no-go getting free shares. But the question then morphs into co-investment. Okay, well, if I invest in shares, can I get a match in shares? Can they be in performance shares? And how does that conversation morph? Making it, in turn, easier to meet your minimum shareholding requirements, but also achieving what the shareholders want you to achieve, which is having your executives invested in the organization, having skin in the game, feeling what the shareholders feel. And Mariangela, I see your hands up, and I'm going to hand over to you. But Kosi, what I also think, in a recent Remco that Kosi and I were in, we were discussing the trend about stakeholder engagement, and not just engaging with your shareholders, but engaging with your employees. And I think that becomes relevant in these kinds of conversations and dealing with the Great Resignation. And maybe, Kosi, you can give us a bit of context on that as well after Mariangela makes her point.
Thanks, Leila. So I just wanted to add that I think one of the issues or the biggest things about Great Resignation is that it's almost taken the power or shifted the power from the employer onto the employee. And I think now, employees have greater choice, or at least there's a perceived greater choice in their career opportunities. And so they're looking further. And so they want to see greater incentives from their companies. And I think that often comes with the challenge that many companies have, in that their incentive schemes are not as attractive as they were because of the impact of COVID. But also it comes at a very bad timing, because as we see, the importance of retention being put on the table, you also have the corresponding increase of shareholder power in the proposed Companies Act amendments. And so you're at a time where you need to retain your key talent and key skills and find a way to introduce some form of retention mechanism, but you need to find it in a way that is kind of appealing or kind of acceptable to shareholders, so as to avoid, kind of taking or retaining individuals at the expense of, kind of failing your votes, which are potentially binding. So I think it's not really the great time for the Great Resignation, but it's been a few years of unexpected events.
But that's a good point, because Kosi, talking about stakeholder engagement, obviously shareholder engagement becomes more important in the context of the Companies Act as well. So it's not only, it's not only a reactive, my shareholder says this and I respond to that. And I think we've seen that amongst our clients. But let me hand over to you, and then you can share some thoughts on that.
Thanks, Leila. But just talking to our engagements with our clients yesterday and talking about stakeholder engagement, I think what became very much evident is that it needs to happen more often than not. And especially now that people are evaluating their lives and seeing whether it's worth it working for a specific company or not. And just like looking at purpose, what their purpose is their purpose aligned to that of the company? We basically found that it's become very important to just engage with your stakeholders, like beyond shareholders, highlighting to them what the benefits are, and actually just explaining how these plans work. Because more often than not, you might at executive level find that they understand how the plans work, but moving lower down in the companies, they might not even understand how the plans work. So for me, it highlighted the importance of engaging with stakeholders, explaining to them how these things work, how they'll benefit. Because Andreas mentioned that historically we found that shareholders were very much against co-investment plans, specifically because you give a matching share to the executive in question. But as soon as you highlight the benefits associated with this, they could be welcoming of these type of plans. So it's all about engaging with these stakeholders and explaining to them the benefits versus the disadvantages of these kind of plans, and just making sure that everyone's is in the same page.
Yeah, and I think, something that we've also been talking about is, do you really understand what your employees value and what they want from an incentive structure? And can we just throw cash at the problem? And a point we make in this article is retention incentives are often just ineffective. Why is that? Because we've all seen, individuals that take retention incentives or retention bonuses, and then they leave. They get bought out by competition, or they, decide to leave anyway, they pay it back, whatever. It doesn't seem to actually have much impact. And yes, you can price them out of the market, but in the current war for talent, it's just almost impossible to throw that sort of money at the problem. So I think that's the classic retention is a farce. I mean, I always used to use this phrase and say, are you actually retaining anyone by giving them a retention bonus? Then you can put the tail on it and then say, well, you have to hang around for 3 years to get this. And then what happens? Well, that becomes psychologically so ineffective, because an individual that has to wait 3 years for some sort of cash doesn't actually value it, or they value it, research, our own research has shown, at about a third of what it's actually worth, even executives. So, we really need to think creatively about this. And globally, PwC has also been partnering up with a company called True Choice, and really doing some deep analysis to say, let's get in there. Let's not just do your typical employee engagement surveys. And I'm sure everybody dreads doing them, and everybody dreads going through the detail, because you think, what am I really learning from this? And if yours is anything like ours, it's always reward and recognition is low. But it always is, because no one's ever satisfied with that. And it doesn't actually tell you how to solve the problem. What this True Choice survey does is it goes in there and it actually asks them, what do you value? And it gives options and options. And it's a very interesting algorithm that ekes out of the employee what do they value, and it attributes a value, understanding that each employee will have different priorities and different needs, and then in that way assisting you to create an incentive structure and create a benefit structure that actually speaks to your employees and is motivating and offers them the benefits and the package that they are looking for. And that really speaks to fair and responsible remuneration, because it's about, how do you look after your employees? It's not just about paying them a cash bonus, and maybe that's not what they're looking for, but affordability comes into it. You can actually get more bang for your buck by giving a benefit which is worth more psychologically than just a cash bonus that you're going to defer for 3 years. And I think we need to start having those conversations and thinking about it creatively when we're looking at these kinds of things.
So Leila, we're all believing that the Great Resignation will eventually morph into the grand bargain. That's what it will boil down to, where people get to a point where you structure something that makes it worthwhile, and the agility in how you can approach the person will tie in with a common value of flexibility. And I think that's going to be key to any fluid HR strategy or human capital strategy going forward.
I like that, Andreas. Did you just coin that term?
Yes. I thought what would be nice to follow up the key, because I thought the term Great Resignation was so in your face.
So everybody can look out for our article in the ED report in August, which will be titled Organizing the Grand Bargain or something like that. We'll think of a better title. Yeah, so I think that's basically what it is. And that's essentially our approach to looking at the Great Resignation and saying that there are things that you can do from a reward and benefits perspective. There are real actions that you can and should be taking. And those include, Kosi's mentioned stakeholder engagement, speaking to your employees. And this is a big trend. This is something which we can't ignore. Those employee engagement surveys don't cut it anymore. And I think a lot of us have been feeling this for a while now, that they're a bit jaded. We need to have a deeper understanding. We've got all this data, we've got all this technology. How are we harnessing it and actually using it to give us insights that allow us to be more effective in our roles? The problem is with that, it requires an investment up front. And I always use the example of when you bring in Workday or when you bring in Salesforce or something big into your organization, you've got to make that upfront investment, and you see the results, over a period of time. So it's no exception. We need to think about human resources function or human capital function in a strategic way, and no longer in a reactive or an operational way. And I think that is where we need to go. Looking at the co-investment, speaking to shareholders, another part of that stakeholder engagement is, as Andreas is saying, structuring these things in a way that we can actually make them meaningful, make them appealing, but also, as Mary Angela is saying, do it in a way that you're not going to get that shareholder pushback, and do it in a way which achieves your shareholder goals. So your question, thank you, Gerald. Would you motivate co-investment plans to shareholders in addition to or in lieu of LTIs? It's a good question. So traditional LTIs are under strain at the moment, as we've seen. And the feedback we're getting from clients is, and I'm sure many of you will share similar stories, at the top, the executives want more leverage structures, more wealth creating structures. They say we're in South Africa, we're taking the risk, we want the returns, we want access to those increased return opportunities. That's the market that we're in. That's the profile of the market that we're in. But simultaneously, they're saying to us that the senior management band, the middle management band, etc., are not understanding, or don't have the appetite for these kinds of things. So we are seeing a kind of a divorce. Some clients are going and reward team chip in and add to what I'm saying. But some clients are definitely going the co-investment for all, and they're doing it in a way that co-investment has some leverage and structuring it quite uniquely. Others are going the way of, let's have something really different, or morphing, going back to options for the top layer and saying, let's have something really leveraged, really appealing. They understand it, they can drive it. Let's motivate them with that. But for everyone else, they're asking for more certainty. They're saying, we didn't enjoy the fact that our LTIs didn't pay out over the last few years because of things that were outside of our control. Give us something where we can still earn, but we're willing to take less upside for more certainty. And that's where co-investment becomes a valuable tool, because they are making the choice to opt in, and they will get the match, and that secures their loyalty. You are still going to lose some people, but our experience has been it makes individuals think twice about leaving.
So Leila, I think that it will probably be, if I had to look at it, if you want to replace co-investment with, I definitely believe the senior and middle management layer would resonate better with it, because it does give them more certainty, specifically in that period where you need a bit more certainty with flex up and down based on investment horizon, but you need a bit more certainty. For executives, I would say that if you're in a turnaround strategy or something where the business is trying to drive maybe an ESG implementation, co-investment would also work. Maybe in the interim, whilst you're trying to re-ratchet your LTI or reconfigure your LTI, but the tenure will have to be longer and the matching will have to be a larger multiple as well if you're going to take it away, if you're going to take the LTI off the table for an interim solution. So, because I think that's the major issue, is that you've got an LTI that's got a 3-year horizon, but you need to embed ESG in your business that's got a 5 to 7 year horizon, and the one could impact the other, potentially in the shorter term negatively. And that has to be weighed up to say, well, let's put certainty on the table and take the noise out of the system in the interim while we switch over.
And I see that kind of ties into what Sue's saying in the comments. So co-investment sounds great. It's perhaps easier to buy into as a participant as you hold a longer term view, and making the comment that COVID has made us shorten time horizons with people living in the here and now, and people assuming that cash is more important. So yeah, definitely the case. And with the ESG, we now need to change the narrative and get people thinking longer term again, because it's exactly that. The great resignation is people thinking here and now, this is what I want from my life right now. And I think, Andreas, Kosi, Mariangela, Sue makes a very good point in that sense. But then she finishes off by saying, we need a good selling proposition for co-investment. It is a real solution. And I can't emphasize speaking to your employees more and having employee communication, having those roundtables. There are certain movements, particularly in the UK, Kosi, we were talking about these yesterday, where, you have a director who is designated to speak to employees, or you have a director panel who is designated to speak to employees. Some places, few and far between, have an employee designate that is, sits in certain committees on the board and gives feedback. So the point is thinking about mechanisms where you can get real dialogue, and dialogue is the important word, and that's why employee engagement surveys have fallen out of favor. It is a one-way conversation. Then there's no follow-up, because they're always anonymous, to say, Bob, I always use Bob, you said this. What do you mean by this? You can't do that with an employee engagement survey. But individuals that want to talk and want to, get involved in those conversations in a panel scenario or roundtables or forums, and it speaks to that purpose. We said one of the interlinking themes is purpose. People want to be heard. They want to give their views. They are willing to come to the table and have those discussions. And it's really something we need to look at. So employee buy-in, important. Again, I cannot emphasize, and Mariangela made the point, with the Companies Act and more shareholder power, we need to make sure shareholders are on board. We need to be having those conversations. Don't be shy of talking to your shareholders. What do you guys think about this? This is why we want to do it. And this is who we're doing it for. And this is why we think it's right for us. And this is what we think it's going to achieve. Too often, the REM report writing is an afterthought and the narrative isn't there. But that REM report, I almost want to contradict myself. It should almost be an afterthought, because all the thinking and all the narrative and all the writing should be crafted way before that. The engagement is done with your shareholders. You've got into the rationale and the conversation, and the conclusion is recorded in your REM report. It shouldn't be the first time that you're communicating things. And I think, we've seen in our team a couple of ISS reports coming out now which say, we're not supporting this because we can't see the rationale for your decision. And that word is coming up. Is there another comment in the chat? Garth. Hello, Garth. Seems like we're a step ahead as our LTI plan. ShopRite includes a shout out to ShopRite. Includes a co-investment award with a share mix for all participants, which works really well since we redesigned our scheme in 2019. Our match is based on a 1-for-1 basis. Yeah, thanks, Garth. I mean, exactly. A good example. And I mean, I think we can see in the market that how that's working. And it would be interesting to know. Well, I think it'll be interesting for everyone else to know what your attrition rates are looking like, and those kinds of things based on that. Yeah, so I think those are really the themes that are coming through, and those are really the where we need to be going with the thinking. And I used a term yesterday in the session we had for REMCO members. REMCO members need to be bold, and they need to be creative, but they need to have courage and conviction to make these decisions and change the status quo and challenge the status quo. And that's what we're really seeing now. We're seeing, as we look forward, we need to be challenging the status quo and not just accepting that this is the way we need to do things. And we had a little bit of movement with a lot of companies moving to the single incentive. We think the time is right to be having these kinds of conversations. Okay, so I think let's, in the interest of time, Andreas, did you have another comment to make?
Sue's comment is lingering in the back of my mind, and I think that maybe we as part of the selling point, we need to show people the risk of being very consumption focused and not being willing to invest in your own effective retirement. I think the risk that we're going to have is that because people are so consumption focused, they want the cash here and now, is that we're typically going to see the problem not manifesting immediately, but in 15, 20 years time, when the 35 to 40-year-olds who should have been saving or at least investing towards their retirement have got nothing to show for it. And that's gonna, that conversation tied in with, you can have flexibility and consume now, but you're typically going to have to work until 75 to be able to retire, should be and some people will find that attractive, and you're not going to be able to retain someone with that mindset without them having a very clear alignment with your purpose, because they need to look at themselves and they need to look at how they evolve and how their demands evolve immediately. So I think there's going to be struggle in retaining in those instances. But if we can get the other person who typically thinks, I don't actually want to work until I'm 75, to understand the benefit of having more certainty with something that would not necessarily go boom or bust, but give you over the longer term more value, specifically with the match. I think there's something to this. But it does mean we need to do a bit of an analysis, a bit of a sexy charts, whatever we want to call it, to illustrate the principle.
That's the thing. And I think, thanks, Mimi. I think that, the risk, we highlighted purpose, risk, retention. We're talking about all of these at once now. The risk associated with the LTI structures is not necessarily appealing. People are reassessing their lives and they're saying, I just want a good life, actually, because my life might be shorter than I ever thought it was going to be. I might, heaven forbid, die from COVID next year. And I want to make sure that I've done what I needed to do. So they're willing to accept a slow and steady rather than a fast and risky. It's let me buy a Volvo time, to use a funny analogy, instead of let me get that racy BMW. That's where we're going. And I think that speaking to employees and seeing those kinds of things coming out and understanding where their heads are at, but having the dialogue, and I want to stress that again, instead of having that one-way conversation and trying to interpret what they're saying. Okay, so I think in the interest of time, let's move us along to the next topic, because I think it's also a very important one and in some ways links to this, talking about the living wage, talking about are your employees among the working poor, talking about fair and responsible remuneration. What does that mean? We've been talking about it for a while. We haven't necessarily wrapped our heads around it completely. And I think I'm going to hand over to Kosi. And Mariangela, I'd like you to also share with us the stats in terms of ESG strategy and fair pay policy that we pulled up in our NED survey. I know we're going to still get to that.
Thanks, Leila. And maybe before I start with discussing the living wage, I just want to say that perhaps the story should be we need to demonstrate sustainable value. I know shareholders have been asking for it for like 2 years now, and maybe it's time that we show our employees what sustainable value is for them. And maybe that's only when they'll buy into the CoInvestment Plan. But just with regards to are your employees living amongst the living poor, this topic came along with quite a lot of things happening in the market. And one of them was the proposed amendments to the Companies Act that requires that companies basically disclose certain ratios in their REM reports. And we basically took a step back and said, wait a minute, is this the right way to go? What's the purpose of disclosing these ratios? And is there something better that companies can do to show that they're paying it equitably and fairly to their employees? Because in essence, how we looked at it is that the Companies Act requires companies to provide these ratios because they want to see if companies are paying equitably. But there's so many ways of getting around it. So we just thought, is this the right way of doing it? Is there an alternative that companies can consider? And I mean, just specifically in South Africa, for years now, the national minimum wage has been the anchor point. And when companies pay above that, or when companies pay at that rate, generally they perceive themselves to be within the boundaries of the law. And when we did our research, we basically found that approximately 55.5% of South Africans are living beyond the upper bound of the poverty line of 1,335. And I think what is shocking to me is that in addition to just 55.5% of our population living above the upper bound of the poverty line, is that when employees are paid the national the minimum wage, we found that they generally have a shortfall of 1,353 for core three household expenses such as electricity, food, and transport. So what that demonstrated is that the national minimum wage is not enough to be paying employees. And like we said, we basically took a step back and we basically asked ourselves, is there something better that companies can do? And with that being said, is there another reference point that companies can consider when remunerating their employees, and also when just thinking about whether you can make the lives of your employees better, and obviously being a purpose-driven company. Leila indicated in her introduction earlier on that there is no formal definition of the living wage in South Africa. However, there is one that's internationally used, and basically paying your employees a living wage means that you're paying them a frugal income that allows them a decent standard of living. And just having identified that there is a living wage that other countries use out there, we thought it would be just better to quantify it from a South African context, just to see that if you were to consider it, what would be the figure that you are looking at for the purposes of your company. And then in addition to that, we also thought, in the event that companies are considering this and they're basically considering changing the lives of their employees, basically changing the society for better, what would be the steps that you should consider implementing if you want to basically pay your employees above the living wage? I'll just take Mariangela's point before I go to the figures that we actually calculated for the purposes.
I was going to say, Kosi, don't keep us in suspense. We want to know those figures. Just while I've got the mic, we also just opened a poll up in the chat box. So if you'd like to give us, we're just asking, is your organization talking about the living wage or not? So just give us a yes or no there if you have a chance.
Cool. Sorry to interrupt, Corsi. I just wanted to mention that I love the concept of the work input. Not that I love the concept, but I think it's so interesting because when we first started with the fair and responsible, remuneration discussion, we had a workshop with a client, and they were talking about how they found it so challenging and that they thought they were paying their employees a reasonable wage, but that when they actually had the dialogue and the conversation with these lower level employees, they actually found that although they were taking home an income, it just wasn't sufficient to cover their needs. And of course, he will give us the figures, but I just thought that, every company, and I think it's widespread, we can all agree that we need to pay people a sufficient income for them for them to cater for their needs and all those expenses. And that, if we have this large number, it can't help anyone or do any service to the company. But yes, sometimes the implementation of it and how to actually do it is sometimes the challenge. And I think at the time that we were discussing with the client, they said, we're trying to find original ways to do it. Sometimes it's not always something that we can improve or increase their income. That's just not a possibility. But there are other ways that we're trying to almost improve or increase their take-home pay through either, the bulk purchasing power that companies have, which their low-level employees won't necessarily have, but just finding a way to make the living wage work if you're not able to do it from an affordability increase to income perspective.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, Maria Angela, I think for me it highlights the importance of engaging with your employees now more than ever. And the other thing is that, which you just actually mentioned, that it doesn't have to be all in cash. There's various ways that you can help your employees and basically making sure that they have a decent standard of living. And I've had a client negotiate interest rates for their employees, for instance. I'm not sure how they actually got it right, but it was something that they thought important, that they saw important for their employees, and they actually went out and helped the employees in that regard. So it doesn't need to be in cash, all of it, but just making your employees' lives easier goes a long way. And we just spoke about the Great Resignation, and we said you need to engage with your employees because not everyone wants cash. But there is ways of quantifying the value that you add to your employees' lives. And in essence, at the end of it all, you'll end up retaining your employees because if happy employees basically stay with their employers.
Yeah, I think we also need to grapple with the concept of affordability because so often it's given as the the be all and end all defense to why one is not paying a living wage. And I think that needs to be grappled with, and we need to actually reassure ourselves that we are doing the analysis to say, okay, we need to know how many employees do you have below the living wage. You need to understand in your supply chain what the situation is in order to be truly responsible. Then we need to say, in order to bring our employees all onto the living wage, what is the cost? And that cost needs to be looked at relative to your entire bill and, really grappled with in terms of performance pay as well, before you can say affordability is a problem. And, often I think the response is also skilled versus unskilled labor, and unskilled labor is replaceable. And the response to that is really, it is an ethical standpoint, which organizations are being expected by consumers, by shareholders, by other stakeholders to take, which is that we will not have somebody working for our organization who is living in poverty. They are giving an honest day's work, and yet they are living in poverty. And I think that statement, for me, is so stark. And that's really what we need to be putting on the table and saying that is the fact if we are paying them the minimum wage.
Miranda, do you want to go?
Sorry, Corsi, I didn't know if you wanted to do the numbers, but what I wanted to add was that I think the challenge over the last couple of years has been that this focus has been, more on keeping people employed, as, the impact of COVID has almost, crippled many businesses, where they almost have had to make that decision between saying, well, in actual fact, the choice or the decision for us is how do we keep people employed? And I think what is quite good in this market is that we're seeing the economy and we're seeing the, companies growth strategies and, recovery strategies start to work, so we can start having this conversation again, and we can make the focus again on saying we've got employees, and, employment is one aspect of, looking after low level or, the vulnerable in society, but also how can we build up and help them and create a greater kind of, remuneration structure for them.
Yeah. But with regards to just companies doing the right thing, specifically for unskilled labor, I can't remember the name of the survey, but we actually summarized it as part of our ED reports last year, right? And one of the things we learned is that even consumers want to be associated with purpose-driven companies. So basically, customers will come to you if you're purpose-driven and you're making a difference in society. So even doing the right thing basically means that the company is going to be in good standing with its customers and get even more customers going forward. So doing the right thing doesn't just work for the employees, it also works for the company itself. I'll move over to the numbers, and then I'll just talk
Please do.
to a couple
Keep some suspense.
to a couple of things that companies need to consider when implementing the living wage. But we basically looked at 3 reference points in determining what the living wage would be in South Africa. And we've basically determined what it is. It is an approximation, but we've done it for an individual that doesn't necessarily have a family. And then we've done one for a person that basically supports a family of 4. So the first reference point is we looked at international living wages. So we looked at other countries, and we basically applied the cost of living adjustment and also adjusted those the living wage by exchange rates to get it to ZAR. And what we found is that for a person that's single and lives by themselves, the living wage would be 7,448, whereas the median contribution for a family of 4 would basically be approximately 9,500 rands. And then our second reference point was basically the decent standard of living project that approximated that the average South African needs approximately 7,900 rands to have a decent standard of living. And then our third point was basically the living wage published by the Trading Economics that estimated that for a single person, they need 6,700 rands per month to have a decent standard of living, with a family requiring approximately 10,600 rand to have a decent standard of living. So in summary, for a single person that doesn't have a family, it's between the ranges of 6.7 and 7.9, whereas if you're looking at a family of 4, it's approximately 9,400 rand and 11,000 rand. So those are just the figures that we've put in our report for companies to consider where we're looking at the living wage.
Kosi, I think what's worth pointing out on those figures is why have we looked at a family of 4? Why have we looked at a single individual? I think what we need to be very, very aware of is when we talk about, and everybody's used to, I think by now, the 7.5 to 8, grand a month figure in terms of living wage. So it's not that we're putting out a new figure there. We're saying, emphasizing the point that that is for a single individual looking after themselves. So if I live at home and I look after myself, that's the salary I need to meet my basic needs, by the way. What are we talking about? We're talking about food, we're talking about electricity, we're talking about transport, we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about education, the basic. That's what I need just to live a frugal life, a dignified life, just so I'm not living in poverty. I'm not struggling to make ends meet, but I don't have, there's no free spending money in that. It's the basics.
And Leila, just to emphasize as well, and that will be the cash component the person needs to take home for them to be able to cover those expenses.
Yes, thanks, Andreas. Yeah, good point. That is the cash component we're talking about, that they need to take home for them to cover that. So, other aspects of that's not, oh, thank you, the light came on. That's not a total remuneration that we're looking at. And that answers Claire's point as well. And what I wanted to say was, we need to really grapple with this living wage concept, because internationally, when we talk about living wage, you've got to realize that healthcare is different, transport is different. These things are either subsidized or paid for by the state. Education. Individuals within South Africa are spending their cash that they take home on a different bundle of goods. It's not just food. We talk about food and inflation and all of that. Food is one thing. if you're sick and you need to pay for healthcare, there's no buffer, you know. So that's the one point I wanted to make. And the other point, Kosi, which I think is important for us to pull out here, is that the average South African has 4 to 5 dependents. So when we're talking about a family, and obviously our unemployment rate is, if not the highest in the world, one of the highest in the world. So that's different. So it means that when you are paying that individual, you can more or less be certain that they have at least 2 dependents, 3, 4 is more likely, possibly 5 dependents on that salary. And that isn't the employer's problem to solve. But the employer cannot distance themselves from the reality. And I think that's an important point that needs to be made, or an important, you know, fact that needs to be raised. So what we're saying here is know the facts. And when you know, go forth and you have these conversations within your organizations, let us talk about the facts and take the emotion out of it, because it often gets quite an emotive topic, and affordability comes up, and skilled versus unskilled. And, you know, with the unemployment rate, I can replace unskilled labor, etc. I'll hand over to Andreas, and I saw Richard has a question, which I will also get to in a moment.
So when we have a look at the living wage studies that were done by 26 European countries, they applied the assumption their unemployment rate isn't close to ours. They applied the assumption that in a family of 4, 2 people are contributing to the joint family need. One person on a full-time basis, 5 days a week. The other person on a part-time basis, 4/5 or 80%. So one needs to understand that it is not the business's responsibility to say, well, if there's a family of 4, I need to pay, as if only one person has a job, do I need to pay double to that person so that the family can have the need? That's a separate ask with regards to growing unemployment and how do you address the unemployment need. It's more about asking the question,
growing employment.
What growing employment and paying the people that you do employ a dignified pay. So if you have a look at that band, it effectively moves, if you individual, 7,500 is what the approximation is of what you need to look after yourself. When you're a family of 4 and you are one of the 2 contributing people, and let's assume you are the full-time contributing person, that would escalate to about 9,500 or 9,800 rands a month, because you also need to look after the basic food needs of your 2 dependent children, okay, within the business or within the family. So pragmatically, from where you evaluate yourself is the question that's being asked, do we need to differentiate between X and Y? I think from a greater South African perspective, we probably could argue that even a single person has got a dependent, because there will be a sister, a family member as a consequence of our society, that you probably need to have a look at what would be the standard pay for one person contributing to 4 as an ideal living wage within your business. But there's always progressive steps that you can take to get there. You go from 3.6 or 4 to 7.5 to 9.5. We all understand it can't be done in one go.
But certainly not differentiating according to what people are getting. But taking it into consideration when you are determining what your wage, your minimum wage, not the national minimum wage, your minimum wage will be as an organization. All right. So, Kosi, was there anything else? Mariangela, did you give us the stats from the survey on the fair pay policy and ESG? Kosi, was there anything else you wanted to mention on this before we move along?
No, I think we've covered everything, Leila. Let's just get the stats from Mariangela, then we can move along. And Andreas has his hand up.
An outcome. I'm so on this point of my seat. What the outcome was of the poll that we raised? Has anybody answered?
So perhaps while people are, the last couple of people are giving their responses, maybe let me just give you the stats that Leila mentioned a few minutes ago. So what I wanted to say was that obviously, and I'll get into the discussion of our NED Remco survey, but one of the results that came in was one of the questions related to, have you or has your company developed a fair pay policy? And 51% of the respondents actually indicate that they did, in fact, they had put together a fair pay policy, contrasted to the 40% who were still in the process of developing it. And obviously, fair and responsible pay has been a conversation which has been, going on since King 4 came in, or even longer. What was interesting to see was that if you contrast it to our question, which we asked about an ESG strategy, and obviously ESG has been topical, but it's only probably gained momentum in the last year or two since COVID. You actually saw that 61% of individuals or companies had in fact developed and adopted a strategy, compared to the 37% who were still in the process of doing that. So just looking at it coldly, it looks like the focus is on ESG and there's not enough, or companies haven't yet done a deep dive into their fair and responsible policies. And obviously, I think sometimes ESG is seen as the easier option. You include something, and fair and responsible pay is sometimes seen as the more challenging option in developing a living wage and doing that work. But
and maybe just to mention, obviously in our executive directors, I think it was our executive directors report last year, August, we did a whole fair pay journey, because I think a lot of us are still grappling with, well, what does it mean? And we also don't want to just put words on a page. We actually want to take real action and to understand what is the journey that we need to be going on, and what is the action that we need to be taking. And yeah, developing a fair pay policy is important. And for us, that was a signal that of who's actually been talking about and thinking about this, because generally the first step is developing some sort of policy. We didn't ask how sophisticated is the policy or what elements does the policy have. We just said, do you have a policy? And it was 51%, I think. That's quite telling. Only half. So we've got a journey still to go. All right. So I think the poll's closed. And I think, yeah. So thank you, Sachin. Just trying to see how to actually see the results. I think if you answer the poll and you go into the results, as you go into where you answer the poll, you'll see the results. But essentially, it was very, again, funny enough, it was 50-50, other than one vote. So essentially echoing the results of our NED survey, which said basically that half of us are discussing these issues and half of us aren't. So I guess the challenge is to those that aren't, how can you get this very important topic on the agenda? It's the right thing to do. And I want to close off by saying, we've mentioned a couple of times now the Companies Act amendments. I'm sure you're all very familiar with them. We're not going to go over them again. But to emphasize, there's the wage gap. It's going to come in. I don't know if it'll take that form, but it's going to come in, and it will be mandatory to disclose the wage gap between your highest and lowest earners. At the moment, it's top 5 versus bottom 5% of employees in the organization. It is coming in some form. How are you going to build your narrative around that? What are you going to signal to the market in terms of what you are doing to make sure you as an organization are paying fairly and responsibly? When somebody picks up your report and sees that massive ratio, which inevitably is going to cause discussion. And the better you've performed, the bigger that ratio is going to be. So we need to be prepping ourselves and thinking about our narratives very carefully, and making sure that we are really, doing what needs to be done, doing the background work, calculating the gaps, making sure we have the policies in place, and making sure that ethically we are comfortable with where we are in the process. Okay, I saw a comment, Lindiwe. I'm glad you managed to get in, Lindiwe. How do we also address some of the causes of poverty or inequality through, though, especially for the next or future generation? For example, financial planning, inclusive of family planning, so that we could also help young people better consider or manage the cost implications of big families, etc. Yeah, I think very, very good question, Lindiwe. And I can't say that I have the answer, but it's definitely part of, I think, what you're highlighting for me is the need to consider when we look at fair and responsible pay. We get so caught up on the word pay. It's not just about pay. It's about the whole ecosystem that you are creating for this employee. And it really, for me, comes back to ethical leadership and responsible employer, being a responsible employer. And what does it mean to be a responsible employer? And how has that concept morphed and evolved from 10 years ago? And what does it mean today? And we know many organizations, I think that the minds are quite, well known for doing this, do things like financial training and offer those kinds of things. I mean, even PwC does it, by the way. We have courses that we can go on that help us, train us up in terms of financially managing your own finances. And there are even some instances where it's quite interesting, where they say you can bring your spouse along to this course. Your spouse is also invited, which is quite unique and interesting. So that's on an opt-in basis. So certainly, and I think if I think over the last 5 years, and my team members will agree, and any other PwC members that are on the call, we have upped the game in terms of learning and e-learnings and just content. We have a whole, just to share some personal what's going on in PwC, we have a whole database of learning. We call it Vantage, that any employee can tap into with playlists. Whatever you might be interested in, globally curated playlists that pull from TED Talks, we have summaries of books, summaries of very important books, or very, important is not the word, popular books, different news articles, different e-learnings that are PwC curated, different courses from external organizations, curated playlists that everybody is upskilling themselves as they go along. And I think this speaks to a number of different things. It speaks to the multiple job initiative. So, having employees that are skilled up to do multiple different things. And that becomes relevant if you're in an industry like mining, for example, where we say, well, automation is going to happen. How do we reskill and redeploy these individuals into our organization in some other form? And that might be technical or, practical training in some cases. We're PwC. For us, it's knowledge training, it's soft skills. But you need to think about and grapple within your organization, what does it mean to reskill? How do we build the jobs? Andreas was saying building employment. How do we build the jobs, but at the same time look after the employees that we have? And how do we build jobs in a way which also delivers the profits which we've committed to our shareholders? But how do we do that in a sustainable and a responsible way? And it's all a balancing act, and it's something that Remcos will really have to grapple with, and really are grappling with. But yeah, I think, Lindy, I answered your question perhaps in a very roundabout way, but I think the most important takeaway from your question is we need to be having these discussions. We need to be dialoguing with our employees and understanding these are the real issues that they're grappling with. Understanding when they take home the cash, what does it get spent on? And then in thinking about how do we reskill and upskill our employees. Lindy was saying, sounds great. We're looking at that as part of our overall well-being, wellness support. We would really benefit from what other organizations have done to ensure that their employees are financially fit. Please share. Okay, Lindy, well, I'll definitely share. Kosi and I will share with you. And I'm just thinking that, perhaps this is an area of interest that we need to pick up on and do some more thought leadership on, and just include in one of our next reports, because it's such an important topic. So thanks for raising that, Lindy. I know you guys are always ahead of the curve on these things, so I think many people look up to you. All right, so that was a little bit delayed, but I think important discussion. I think let's move along to the non-executive director survey. And as mentioned, it's the first time we did this. I think Mariangela's brainchild. It worked out amazingly. And it was really insightful to understand what is top of mind, what is top of the agenda. We will be releasing, hopefully, a larger thought leadership piece in the upcoming months that just unpacks some of these things. As you can imagine, in a 2 to 3 page article in our report, you can't get everything out there. But Mariangela is going to take us through the highlights, and we can, discuss some of the things that did come up.
Okay, great. Thanks, Leila. So I thought Andreas wanted to say something, but I see he put his hand down. So I think the point was covered. So like Leila said, this NED Remco member survey that we did last year, it was almost, we wanted to put the spotlight or share the microphone with NEDs and find out, we observe, or we see the trends, but what were their viewpoints and what is it like sitting on a Remco in this, current day and age? Because I think we can all agree, and the results of the NED Remco survey will show that being a Remco member is not a straightforward or, simple task. I think a few years ago it was seen as something that was, more of a, soft committee, but I think with all of the, requirements and, ESG, fair pay, Companies Act amendments, all these factors have now put additional pressure on them. And so when we asked the NEDs, and 51 of them completed it, I can see 1 or 2 of them on the call today, so thank you for completing it. Through the 51 NEDs, the 4 main trends that came up, and some of them we've discussed during the course of this morning's discussions have been ESG and fair pay, and obviously speaking about the policy and how to incorporate ESG into the short-term and long-term incentive structures. And there was obviously a lot of focus area for companies. And I'll move on to the next slide just to show you what companies' priorities and what the risks are. And if you look at the priorities identified by the NEDs who participated, ESG and linking it to executive remuneration structures was top of mind for them. And I think this speaks to obviously the lot of shareholder pressure that they're experiencing, but also the movement of where we are from a remuneration and reward perspective is that ESG is top of mind. But if you also look at the risks, they also further identified that, social inequality, which we just discussed with fair and responsible pay, that was similarly one of the risks they identified and one of the concerns that they needed to deal with. What I found quite interesting was the priority list in terms of succession planning in executive and management. And I think that speaks to our earlier point about the Great Resignation. And what I think is most concerning or most challenging is that, with the Great Resignation, there's a challenge in having to fulfill or have succession planning. And if you look at the age group, which is, leaving, it's looking at the 30 to 45-year-olds. And those are often the, employees levels who are being primed to, eventually fall into those higher senior management and executive roles. So I think that's one of the challenges they identified, which I think was quite interesting. But also you can see that health risks and the impact of macroeconomic volatility is still a concern for them. And I think that's still, I think we've spoken about it in a few webinars that we've done, COVID, it still shows, it still lingers, despite us all hoping that one day it will disappear and it won't be as larger feature. It still shows that NEDs are still impacted by COVID and still having to take into consideration the impacts of COVID. And a lot of companies, they thought 2021 last year was going to be the year in which, their companies would recover from COVID and it would not have an impact. And then unfortunately we had all of the different waves, which put additional pressure, and companies didn't see the recovery that they were hoping for. And I think that translated into NEDs still having to consider it. And then obviously, as we mentioned earlier on, the Companies Act amendments, I think those were released in October last year. And I think they're still very much concerning. There's still very much lack of clarity on them. And so we'll have to wait and see what happens on that. But I do think the pressure it's put on REMCO members has increased and made them, kind of being on the REMCO not necessarily be the favorite board to sit on. So for the NEDs on the call, I think our sympathies are with you, looking at all the requirements you have to do. And then one of the other factors was the board dynamics. And obviously that was just speaking, and we had an article in our NED report about it to speak about, the exchanges and the interactions and the different biases that will creep in. And whilst I think that's relevant for board dynamics, I think it's also quite relevant in, it cascades throughout the company. And I think it's important when you look at those biases, I'm sure we can all look at them and kind of, when you sit in a meeting, I always think it's quite interesting. You sit in a meeting and you think to yourself, you can see these biases almost playing against one another. And I think that's incredibly fascinating.
I think also something to highlight, Mary Angela, is, one of the questions that we asked was about onboarding new REMCO members. And because something that came up in the survey as well was, I guess, concern that some REMCO members, and we specifically asked about, we specifically surveyed REMCO members, but some of the questions were to do with the board as a whole and others to do with REMCO. And actually this one was to do with the board as a whole. The concern was that some board members are not experienced enough, or they don't have the materials at hand that they need. And I think for this group that's on this webinar, other than the couple of NEDs that we have, what's relevant in that is how are you and how is management prepping and making available to the non-executive directors the information that they need to take the decisions that they need to make, and giving recognition to the increased roles and responsibilities which they have in this current day and age. And I think that, having had our remuneration committee member roundtable yesterday, certainly some of the feedback that is being received by us is they don't always remember, particularly with non-execs that sit on more than one board, they don't always remember the nitty-gritty, or they don't, deal with the nitty-gritty on a day-to-day. But the way that REMCOs have evolved, they certainly need to understand the nitty-gritty in order to make decisions. So we need to think creatively about how we present REMCO notes, how we present REMCO packs, how we give them access to information. We've talked, PwC, about how do we harness technology. We've put our heads together and come up with the idea for a REMCO dashboard or a board dashboard, that pulls up data and you can automatically see, okay, this is historically what it was. Because otherwise, I mean, all of us will still remember the good old days of printed board packs. If you have to get a couple of board packs from a couple of years, each board pack is that much. You soon have a pile this high, and it's just overwhelming. You can't control F that in hard copy. So how are we facilitating the making of efficient and effective decisions, understanding as well that in a virtual world, it is so difficult to pay attention. It is so difficult. You sit on a webinar like this and you find yourself distracted. And if you're smiling now, working on your emails while you're listening to me, I'm talking to you. But it's okay in this situation. But when it's in a boardroom or it's a virtual REMCO meeting, so often you catch someone out and they weren't listening, or their attention and drifted. And you know what? You can't blame them. They're only human. But what does that mean to bring it back to our risk, theme? What does that mean in terms of risk? And a lot of the media interviews that we've been doing in terms of this version of the report, media have been asking, what are we doing to ensure there is governance and the risk is decreased within these board meetings? And my answer to that is always, they need to have access to the right information. It needs to be presented in the right way. It needs to be dissected. And I think we really need to grapple with that and say, how do we harness technology? I mean, digital disruption is here on the left graph, figure 1.1. They're most concerned about digital disruption. But I almost want to flip that on its head and say, you're concerned about digital disruption. How do you harness the power of technology? And PwC is quite passionate about this, not particularly, I mean, our team is passionate about this, but there are other teams in PwC who are like super passionate about this. How do we harness the power of technology in order to analyze data and make our decision-making process easier? And you'll all know REMCOs that sit and they need to make a decision on a target or whatever the case is. And a couple of my clients have gotten feedback that, hey, these targets that you've set are lower than your actuals from last year. I had one client who the REMCO used to consistently throw out management's papers. And it's so ineffective because they're saying we don't have the information we need. And management's saying, well, you haven't told us what information you need. How can we guess all of the information that you might be looking for? And then it gets thrown out to the next REMCO because ultimately, REMCO members are so busy that they can't reconvene a new meeting. So how do we make these processes more efficient? How do we make them more effective? How do we make sure REMCO has the information that they need? And, things like a shadow board. Are we using things like a shadow board? We asked, are you using orientation, internal, external, detailed board packs, informal sharing of information? Those were all high. The informal sharing, the board packs, and the kind of upskilling yourself. And then when we started getting to trends updates and things by external to make sure you're on top of things, it starts to get lower. REMCO orientation, like a specific REMCO orientation, again, lower. Training with external facilitators, very low. REMCO dashboards or other dashboards, again, very low. And some companies even, or some directors even indicating that there is no action taken. And board members are expected to upskill themselves or to, bring themselves up to speed with what has happened historically. And we all know, dealing with REM data, it is so difficult to grasp what is going on if you haven't been part of the decision-making process and seen it evolve. So it's just a thought I wanted to introduce and just leave everyone with in terms of how do we, as in our roles, assist REMCO with making those decisions, because it's difficult enough in a virtual environment. It's difficult enough with the boardroom dynamics and the culture and so on. And if we're not doing this right, the risk of sitting on a REMCO is just intolerable. PwC team, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add.
I think in addition to that, Leila, just management availing themselves to non-execs and explaining everything, because management works with these things on a daily basis. I mean, it's one of the things that one of the non-execs mentioned yesterday, to say that just management availing themselves and explaining certain things to them really does help, because they work with these things on a daily basis, and they don't. So that really helps REMCO members in understanding concepts, understanding just the context behind an issue before they can make a decision.
Mm. And by the way, I must correct myself. It was 51% of participants cited lack of experience amongst REMCO members, lack of effective decision-making or inefficiencies during REMCO meetings, and a lack of appropriate information from management on issues that the REMCO is required to make decisions on as contributing issues to efficient board dynamics. So I said board earlier, it's actually REMCO specifically, which is, I think, very close to home for all of us. Okay, I see a question coming through. In a smaller company that does not have a dedicated REM team or manager, who would typically train and orientate the REMCOM and board members? So Eralda, that's usually then done externally by your advisor or whoever helps you with those REM matters. But it is a challenge if there is no local owner of that information. And we've actually seen another inadvertent consequence, obviously, of this Great Resignation is the transfer of institutional knowledge. And I've definitely seen, and I'm sure my team will also have similar experiences, that clients are asking more and more for procedural notes and recording practices, because they're saying if this individual, and it's unfortunately with death top of mind, with resignation top of mind, you start thinking, gosh, if I lose this person, is it actually going to be run efficiently? Is anybody going to understand what this person did and how to do it? And that's where, the procedural notes and the practice notes, or whatever you want to call them, admin guides come in, and making sure you have documented and codified. This is who you speak to. This is when you do it. All of that nitty gritty stuff that usually there's that one angel somewhere in your organization that just deals, it just makes it happen. And it's usually an old lady. She just makes it happen. But jokes aside, there is that one person who just quietly gets on with it and makes it happen. And we've seen our clients saying to us, because in some instances those people have been lost, whether that's because they've left, or whether unfortunately it's been for more morbid reasons. But the question is out there, how do we know what that person's doing? How do we get it codified? And gosh, it is not a fun process to actually take the contents of someone's brain like that and put it onto paper. But I cannot emphasize, for continuity, business continuity management, so important. I think there was another comment or question. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just say any final comments, questions, whatever. Please feel free to pop them in the comment box, or stay on the line. But I'm going to wrap up the actual webinar, and then anybody who has comments or wants to chat or whatever, our team will still be on until past, and we can take any other questions that you might have. So it was just a comment from Lindiwe. So we're actually thinking it's key to take each REMCO member through the company's REM policies and variable scheme mechanics to ensure they have full understandings of the matters they exercise oversight over. Lindiwe, so important. But obviously you have the luxury of having yourself who is able to, do that and has the oversight, and can take them through that in the detail and make sure they understand. But you kind of think, you put yourself in a REMCO member's shoes and think, well, how could you possibly start to exercise oversight without that kind of intro? So definitely so important. All right, so I'm going to say thank you to everybody who attended. Thanks for all your questions, all your inputs. Please get a copy of the report. Have a read through. I'd like to think it's an interesting read. Let us know if you have any questions or feedback. We always welcome feedback on the report. Tell us if it was good, bad, exciting or not, and anything you want to see in a future report, let us know. We're going to hang around on the line now in case anybody has any other questions. Otherwise, I gift you 10 minutes back, as they say in the virtual world these days. Thank you, Gerald. Thanks, Lindiwe.